This is the Hauger History Podcast, and that is as low as the blinds go. Welcome to episode 88 of U.S. History, where we're talking about the time period from 1870 to 1920, and we're reviewing for a unit test. And even though we're a bit congested, we're moving on because you need to study for your tests and understand history so as to better understand the present and the future. Let's jump right into it. Enough self-aggrandizement. That's not one of the terms on the test, don't worry. What was the purpose of black codes? Man, what a sad time in history. My classes, we watched pieces of the movies Race and 42, which I think are stellar films. Well done, great acting. And you get to see Chadwick Boseman before he does Black Panther. It's just an amazing talent. But the purpose of black codes was to control former slaves and to limit the advancement that they could have in the world being newly freed. And we talk in class a great deal about what opportunities were there really. There was so much danger around different corners. And the 13th Amendment was created, and that not only did it free the former slaves, but it paved the way for the 14th Amendment, which would give equal protection under the law, that just by being born here, you were guaranteed and were supposed to be protected and given the same routes as everyone else and the same rights. And so from there, I shift because there's so much going on in this time period in history, and part of our text follows labor unions and their progressions and the necessary need for them. And in 1898, Rose Schneiderman organized 20,000 factory working women to become the Women's Trade Union League after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire killed 146 workers in 1911. And that becomes a turning point for me. We talked in class about what it was like working in a factory with long hours, with your children or young people beside you, conditions being dangerous, workers being locked in, and what that would mean as far as rights. And did you really have any rights at the time, or were you just immediately replaced if you were to bring a complaint up because other workers were willing to step in? So lots going on in that field. Then we discussed Native Americans in class chronologically. We jump around a little bit to discuss the purpose of the Dawes Act. And it did seem like there was perhaps some optimism about how the act might enable 160 acres of land to be given to Native American men, but then we come to find out only 25% of the land was actually given by the time the act was repealed. And it was created to give land and rights and stop the wandering of Native Americans and increase farming, but it also did require many Native Americans to become Americanized, to change their cultures, to put children into boarding schools. So there were many, many things that were part of the Dawes Act, and the most common result was failure for Native Americans during the time. According to the 2 or 3 different textbooks, including our own, and some web research, it seemed like what it did was obliterate a lot of Native American culture at that time. So who carried the most dangerous jobs when we jump back into factory conversations and coal mines? It was often the children. They were small. They could fit into small crevices and pieces of furniture or pieces of factory gear and machines and use their small features to get in between and fix things. There was also lots and lots of photographs about the Pennsylvania and West Virginia coal mines and seeing little kids who didn't need as large of clearance to go through and do that work. So they often had some of the most dangerous jobs at the time. We talked about urban dwellings, and we explored San Francisco because it's our local tradition here in the Bay Area, but we talked about New York as well and how tenements became to be the largest multi-story buildings cramped with quarters, often in slums, and how difficult it was to eat, sleep, clean all in the same room and be very crowded and share bathrooms and resources, and how difficult and often dirty that they would become. Between 1900 and 1920, how many workers were members of the American Federation of Labor? We're talking about 4 million people by 1920. And one of the main goals of the AFL, there were many, were better conditions, decreasing work hours, increasing wages, and increasing safety. This was called bread and butter unionism at the time. And a lot of workers would provide a lunch break, but we're talking about one break or some food over 12 hours, and working conditions, hours, and wages were huge problems for people back then. So the process that unions and businesses would use to negotiate with the powers that be at the time, or the organization management, was collective bargaining, putting everyone together and negotiating for better pay and contracts for everybody who was involved. One of the main reasons that unions have declined over this industry and over the time period that we study to modern day are many. They're multifold. But the main reason would have to be there's been a decline in manufacturing. We were about 40% manufacturing, and now by some estimates we're 15 to 20%. So we're not making as much, and most of the jobs that were involved in manufacturing were labor jobs. Without them, they've declined. But of course, and I discuss this with my students, to have many sensitivities for the labor conversation, for the sacrifices that have been made by people who wanted to increase these rights, there's more complex reasons that they've declined, such as in some cases, conditions have improved and they're unnecessary, but in some cases they're not welcomed as well. And we're mostly focusing on the decline of the jobs that mostly were unionized for the main reason that they've declined. Karl Marx later, as in our studies, advocated for socialism and that people's ownership of all production means giving fair treatment to workers and avoiding factories and farms owned by capitalists. His views spread in certain areas of the world, as we're going to discuss later on. 8 men were convicted after the backlash against violence and labor demonstration known as the Haymarket Riot, and we've talked extensively about how difficult that was of a situation for everyone involved. Between 1892 and 1954, 12 million immigrants processed through Ellis Island. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prevented Chinese immigration for 10 years and prevented the immigrants who were here already from becoming citizens. And we talked about that in terms of Angel Island, the Ellis Island of the West, and what life was like for people in the San Francisco area and how the Chinese were discriminated against. So that's been a conversation that's been interesting to have with the class as well. Moving on to how they got here, most immigrants around 1900 traveled by ship in steerage. That was traveling below deck, very filthy, crowded, dark conditions, and the road to getting here was not easy. Countries that filled the need for workers after the Chinese were excluded during those 10-year periods and during that period, Japan, Korea, Brazil, the Philippines, Mexico. You could talk even more, but there was a need for workers after that. Closing one door opened many more, and that 10-year period is a reminder of how discrimination has popped up specifically against different groups of people over history. The persecution and discrimination of those people is known as nativism, the preference for the people who are already here, and against the mass immigration and mass movement at the time that Americans were objecting to. Teddy Roosevelt coined the term for journalists who wrote about the problems and the unseen issues of society, and they were called muckrakers, people that went out, journalists that went and uncovered problems in society and unknown issues and quality control issues that they thought Americans should know about, and they raked muck and were called muckrakers by Teddy Roosevelt. To expose the horrendous conditions of the meat packing plant, Upton Sinclair wrote a very famous book, which he fictionalized a lot of accounts and documented many stories and many retellings of things that had happened in the meat market. Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle. That was the name of that title. And in our class, we explored a few people who owned factories, owned production, were captains of industry. And in the modern sense, we talked about a man who owned CNN, the Atlanta Braves, and the Hawks, and so many Buffalo, Ted Turner, who has been making a lot of headlines along his whole career and recently had an interview on CBS Sunday Morning that we watched a piece of in class. As we progressed through the year and through the units, we talked about political machines. And the Pendleton Act was designed to reduce patronage and set guidelines for merit-based jobs in government instead of people just putting their friends in power who are not trained or who may be corrupt. And Tammany Hall was one example of a political machine in the 1870s, cheating New York City out of money and power and making simple construction jobs like $250,000 budgets into multi-million-dollar campaigns that funded lots of friends and insiders and the kind of thing that was being spoken out against by muckrakers and progressives at the time. A political machine that's full-time, whose politicians' main goal is to gain and maintain political power, is called a machine. I think I started this and ended the same sentence with the term there, political machine. Lastly, but not leastly, just a few short answer questions. And I want you to think, why were people immigrating to America? What were the pull factors between 1840s and the 1890s? In class, we mentioned 7 this morning in the class that we just ended not too long ago, including wages, jobs, opportunity, education, freedom of discrimination, land. That's just a few, right? And why were they leaving Europe during that time, that same stretch? Well, in some cases, famine. In some cases, discrimination. They wanted to practice free religion. They didn't have free land. They didn't have opportunities. They were overcrowded. They were dirty. Many, many things you could choose from, and a much more extensive list than that if you were to just think, stop, consider brainstorm, think about all the conversations we've had through the year. I think that's given me many answers on short answers, just as I think as a student, what were we talking about then? What were the things that were being said around the room? Use that. Lastly, what were the differences between social classes between 1865 and 1900? This was the last activity we completed before our testing class. Everyone should be ready for it. But the rich became richer. That would be one difference. Classes began to separate. The NAACP was founded to give rights and advancement to people who had been discriminated against. Social classes maybe began to be more aware with muckraking and journalism and reading about society's changes. There were the Pendleton Act and other documentation and laws that enacted to make merit-based jobs more important. More immigrants were coming from different societies. Different people were settling in different places. Many, many changes. You could go on for a lot longer, and I want you to think of at least 3 examples as you continue to do research. And with that, our episode comes to a close. I hope you find yourself well-reviewed and studied and ready to go. This is Mr. Hauger saying thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe. You can find the Hauger History Podcast all over iTunes and Podbean. Not all over. You really have to kind of type it in and search for it, but you know what I mean. And I'll see you back in class. And for anyone watching from outside our school, thank you for watching. If you want to see any particular episodes, let us know in the future. And you can check out the Hauger History Resource Center teachers if you're looking for more resources for your students. Thanks. With that, I'm out. I thank you so much. Have a great day. Talk to you later, and class dismissed.